It's a cold winter's day. We've been doing some burning, as you can see behind us, just getting rid of the excess small twigs, small branches that are on the ground. That's to make sure that when summer comes, it's not going to be fire territory, or less likely anyway. Look, I want to look at ideology and religion today, because in the 21st century we're seeing something we haven't seen for a long time. Since the beginning of the reformist and revolutionary processes, which transferred power from the hands of an elite, whether it's a hereditary to self-appointed, to an era where we're seeing the concentration of power in fewer and fewer hands. But the difference between the 21st century and previous century is that we have the capacity to destroy civilizations on the other side of the world. So ideology and religion has mobilizing forces in our society have become more and more important, because in an era where the borders of sovereign nation states have been broken down by technology and the domination of communication by virtual platforms, which are not necessarily tied to specific sovereign nation states, we come to a point in time where mobilizing people for particular ideological or religious causes becomes exceptionally important. Because if we look at the history of the human race, it's a history of that continuous struggle since time immemorial between those who are able to exercise power, whether it's through hereditary means or through force, and those who are able to accumulate wealth. And the interaction or the intersection between those who accumulate power and exercise power and accumulate wealth. So we find ourselves in this particularly difficult situation, which highlights the reason why so many authoritarian figures, as we saw in the first half of the 20th century, are able to mobilize millions of people in struggles that don't actually necessarily benefit them directly. It's a little bit like the Crusaders' invasion of the Palestine, Christ's birthplace, and the mobilization of people, including children, to be involved in those campaigns over a number of centuries. Although religion was used as a motivating force, the ultimate result was the accumulation of wealth and the centralisation of power in fewer and fewer hands. The so-called democratic revolution, which supposedly broke that nexus between power and wealth, has now been totally undermined. So what we see through the manipulation of virtual platforms, what we see, men and women with wealth now dictating parliamentary policy. Not only dictating parliamentary policy, but being involved in ideological movements, ideologically focused movements, which are designed to break down what little power people were able to exercise through casting a ballot. When universal suffrage was introduced, it was believed that those inequalities would disappear. But technological innovations and the ability of people to accumulate wealth and power outside the borders of sovereign nation states has made that situation much more acute. So when we see the US presidential election being fought between two men, one a living corpse, Mr. Biden, and the other one, difficult to describe, let's say a populist, a man who has no idea what the truth is, what facts are, and this is the best that the United States can produce as far as the process is concerned to determine who will lead that nation and have control over the ability to destroy the human race, possibly even the planet. You begin to understand the failures of parliamentary democracy as a force which can be used to introduce reform, as a force to ameliorate the condition people find themselves in. Now, we have seen a huge change in the last 50 years during the deregulation, privatisation, corporatisation, globalisation period, where we have seen the sacrifices which were made by generations of working people and liberal forces in society being overturned in the name of national cohesion, being overturned in the name of equality, being overturned in the name of having a non-discriminatory society. Although the words are there, the institutions and the organisation and the laws which are required to bring that about are not there. And they're not there for one very good reason, and that is the inverse transfer of wealth around the world from those who haven't to those who have. A little bit like a feudal system where everybody knew their place, everybody knew their role, and there was no upward or sideways mobility for people. A little bit like a caste system. So the reality is that in the 21st century, we as a people, we as a race, we as civilizations have really not come very far. You can see me, courtesy of a little bit of technology. You can hear what I have to say, courtesy of technology. You can find whatever you like, from the most obscene to the most glorious on the World Wide Web and these virtual platforms. You can talk to somebody on the other side of the world. You can look at somebody on the other side of the world. You can look at the suffering in Gaza and the Ukraine. But the reality is that people's ability to change what is happening on the ground has disappeared. It's disappeared because of the centralisation of power in a minuscule number of hands. And we see this over the world, where we see sovereign nation states disintegrating as a result of that concentration of power. And the greater the concentration of power, as we saw in World War II, the greater the damage that can be caused. Because the concentration of power and the creation of hierarchy and the inability not just to tell truth to power, but the inability to determine how power is utilised and who is able to exercise that power brings us to the situation we find ourselves in 2024, where if you look around the world, the ability of people to influence their lives at the personal level, the family level, the workplace level, the community level, the state level, the planetary level, is minuscule. It took millions of people over 14 years to ensure that Mr. Assange was returned to Australia. At any particular time, sovereign nation states could have made that decision. But it took that long struggle just to release one human being. When you look at the resolutions which have gone through the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council regarding the Gaza carnage and the continuing carnage as I speak, you'd be forgiven for thinking that if an organisation which theoretically represents over 200 sovereign nation states cannot even ensure that enough food gets in to support 2 million people, you begin to understand the fact that power does not lie in the United Nations. You begin to understand that power does not lie within the structural framework of nation states. You begin to realise that power lies outside these structural apparatuses which we as human beings have created in order to ensure there isn't that concentration of power. So whether we're talking about a democratic regime, a parliamentary democracy, or a totalitarian state, the fact is that we have now reached the situation where a religion, as we saw during the Indian elections, where ideology, as we see in Australia, becomes the main driving force for change, but not change to redistribute wealth and share power, but change to concentrate power in few. Why I'm looking at this particular issue today is very simple. I was very interested to see that Mr. Dutton, the leader of the opposition in Australia at the federal level, and the Liberal National Party have now put forward a proposition to use a nuclear power as a significant mechanism by which to create energy security in this country. Now, I don't want to debate the ludicrous propositions that have been brought up, because obviously I think most people realise the ludicrous nature of this proposition, which is basically designed, it's a fantasy, which is designed to appeal to voters' insecurity. If it's not fear of the immigrant, if it's not fear of somebody of a different religious faith, well, that great fear of not having enough energy supplies, especially in a technologically driven and a technologically totally dependent society. But the Liberal National Party policy has always been one of promoting private enterprise, promoting private investment for private profit. And I was quite interested to see that the private sector is really not that interested in Mr. Dutton's fantasy world and hasn't jumped forward to provide the necessary monetary support to get these projects off the ground. So a political party that it's made its fortune by promoting the private investment for private profit philosophy now is saying that they will use 600 to 800 billion, almost $1 trillion of taxpayers' money to build these reactors. So we see that ideology is the driving force behind this particular proposal, as most proposals. The ideology that we need to centralise all our institutions, because the difference between an energy system which is based on wind and solar, which makes sense in a continent as hot and as wide as this country, the underlying philosophy is to create decentralised energy sources. Now obviously the federal government has not gone down that path. What it is doing, it is giving billions of dollars to the private sector to create centralised energy sources based on renewable wind and solar principles. But the concentration of energy facilities within structures that are highly centralised makes a community highly vulnerable to disruption. So instead of talking about decentralisation, we talk about centralisation of energy sources. Instead of following the usual private investment for private profit mantra, the opposition wants to put the cost totally on the shoulders of the public sector, which means the resources which will be available over the next 20 years if they win the next election to provide essential services for people in this community will disappear. So that's the crux of the matter. The crux of the matter is, what is ideology and religion being used for? Is ideology and religion being used to make the lives of people better? Or is ideology and religion used to concentrate power in fewer and fewer hands and accumulate wealth in fewer and fewer hands and ensure those that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication continue to dominate the marketplace, continue to dominate society, continue to put their needs to create ever-increasing profits, irrespective of the human, social and environmental concerns, before anything else. And that is the struggle we face in the 21st century. It's a struggle against ideology, it's a struggle against religious fundamentalism. Not a struggle to deny people the right to worship who they want in the way they want, but a struggle to see their religious leaders concentrate power in their hands and determine the lives of billions of people. It's the struggle to ensure the Bidens and the Trumps of the world do not have the power to determine the course of civilization, as we see, as Mr. Putin and the Chinese leadership attempt to extend their power. Ideology has no role for these people. Religious belief is of no concern. Their only concern is concentration of power and wealth, and they will use every means at their disposal to ensure it continues unabated. Whether it's imprisoning people, whether it's executing people, whether it's marginalising people, whether it's bombing them into submission. The fact is, we have never been at a more important juncture in human history. We have the capacity to destroy every living thing on this planet. We have the capacity to move forward and make the changes that are necessary to ensure the damage we have created as a species is remedied to some degree. No wonder we see so many people talking about creating a new Earth on some other planet so we can restart this same destructive processes. So ultimately it's up to you. It's up to me, it's up to you, it's up to your children, your grandchildren. Human history is a continuum. But never before in human history have we been faced with the problem of absolute eradication as a species on this planet. Not through environmental factors, not through natural disasters, but through the structures and institutions that we have allowed to be created to extract the maximum amount of wealth from us and to ensure that we will never be able to exercise power through a parliamentary process.